Hi, you're on the Nomad of Dreams channel. Today I'll talk about Wonhyo's philosophy. I'll go through his key ideas and explain why they continue to work in practice. This episode will help you understand which mental steps turn a teaching into a tool for awakening. Where are you listening from now, and what time is it for you? Write in the comments. I like seeing the geography and the clocks of those who listen. Take a deep breath, feel your shoulders, and even out your breathing rhythm. Such a short anchor already changes the quality of attention. Wonhyo appears as a thinker who builds a teaching around the practical transformation of experience. His approach is synthetic, oriented toward connecting different interpretations and testing ideas in living practice. It is precisely the practical orientation that makes his ideas relevant to those who seek not only answers in words, but changes in perception and behavior. I explained 19 key ideas of Wonhyo, the mental steps that made him a central figure in Buddhist thought. Each idea will be analyzed as a concept, what it means, why it works, and where its limits lie. The essence of Wonhyo's development can be described like this. Each concept serves the means of liberation and is evaluated by its effectiveness in transforming the mind. This orientation shifts the focus from pure theory to the effectiveness of practice and to the flexibility of methods. In this key, texts, formulas, and rituals acquire meaning as tools, not dogmas, and are tested by what they do to someone's attention and intention. At the center of his thinking is the idea of one mind as the primary category around which methods of synthesis and criteria of truth are built. This understanding allows one to read different teachings as variants of help for awakening, while maintaining a strict demand that what actually works for living experience be preserved. Practice becomes a criterion, and intention and result the measure of spiritual effectiveness. I'll keep the language simple and close to experience so that each idea remains understandable to a person who is not professionally engaged in philosophy. It's important to mark boundaries. The explanations will focus on the concept itself and its application without historical details and without delving into textual scholarship. Where a technical term appears, it will be explained in plain words so that the meaning becomes immediately usable in practice. The first starting point for our analysis is the idea of the unity of mind. It sets the tone for all the other concepts and explains how different methods and paradoxes can coexist within a single practice. In the following parts, I will unfold each key thought, from the criterion of upaya to the role of paradox as a technique of awakening, from the meaning of emptiness to the place of ritual in supporting inner work. Each topic will receive boundaries of application and an example of how it manifests in everyday practice. We will start with practice. After the theoretical part of each episode, I will offer a simple exercise that can be done immediately in 5 to 10 minutes. These exercises are designed so as not to overload and at the same time to give tangible results. Changes in breathing, shifts of attention, work with images, and short meditations on paradox. In the examples I will give scenarios from everyday life, dialogue, fatigue, fear of making a decision, and show how Wonhyo's idea can be applied right there. Notice the changes. A small rearrangement in relation to a thought or feeling leads to their losing power. An important theme is ethics and intention. Methods can be powerful, so it's important to use them responsibly, to reduce suffering and increase clarity, not as a tool of avoidance. I will also talk about difficulties, resistance, boredom, burnout of practice, and give recommendations on how to work with them. At the end of each episode, I will leave a reading list and the link to additional materials. Subscribe, like, and share your impressions. Write questions. I will select them for the next episode. We'll analyze the most frequent and difficult cases of applying the teaching. And now, take another breath. Exhale more slowly and notice inwardly one thought you usually return to. Upaya is a practical criterion of truth. That which brings liberation or brings one closer to it is considered useful and therefore worthy of trust. Upaya measures the effectiveness of a teaching by how it changes the relation to experiences, to attention and to intention, rather than by conformity to the literal text or by belonging to a particular school. The explanation is simple and functional. A teaching acts as an instrument, and its quality is determined by how this instrument works in the mind. Does it calm clinging? Does it open the clarity of perception? Does it shift motivation toward compassion and clarity? The evaluation involves body, attention, and behavior. Changes are noticeable in habitual reactions to fear, in the ability to endure pain without automatic fleeing, in the readiness to act with open intentions. Texts, formulas, and rituals are tested through experience. The result becomes the criterion, not the final authority of the word. Practice shows which explanations work for a particular stage of the path, and upaya helps choose means with that in mind. The scope of application must be clear. Upaya pertains to the sphere of awakening and methods of awakening, to the transformation of mind and heart. It does not claim the role of a universal test for facts of nature or history. Evaluation by upaya means careful observation of effect, not a frivolous endorsement of any useful technique without regard for context and consequences. It is important to apply the criterion consistently. Check the duration and depth of changes. Consider motive and practice environment. Understand that the same method may be appropriate for one person and ineffective for another due to personal predispositions and life circumstances. The link with Wonhyo is clear and concrete. Wonhyo uses upaya as a filter for reading sutras and interpretations. He views the teaching through the prism of its power to free the mind from attachment and delusion. For Wonhyo, a text becomes a tool when it leads to clarity and a shift in motivation. For him, practice is more important than words because usefulness manifests only in action. Wonhyo insists on carefully testing methods in one's own practice and on keeping teachings flexible and serving people where their experience needs transformation. An important nuance is the ethical dimension of upaya. If a method brings a sense of benefit but feeds selfish tendencies or leads away from responsibility to others, its usefulness is doubtful. Upaya requires not only internal effectiveness, but also conformity to principles of compassion and honesty. Liberation cannot be based on harm. Therefore, Wonhyo emphasizes that methods should be tested within a community of reliable companions and under the guidance of an experienced teacher who can distinguish real change from illusion. Practical testing includes 3 timescales: the instantaneous shift of reaction, the sustained transformation of habits, and the gradual reorientation of life's motivation. One-off experiences of calm are important but not sufficient. True upaya manifests in a stable reduction of greed, anger, and delusion, in care for others, and in clarity of actions. Wonhyo advises keeping a record of observations, discussing discoveries in a group, and not rushing to conclusions, allowing practice time to integrate. Another aspect is adapting teachings to the student's culture and language. Upaya presupposes flexibility of forms while preserving essence. Different images, metaphors, and techniques can serve the same enlightening intention. It is important to be critical of exoticization or mechanical copying of someone else's rituals. Usefulness is tested by result, not by the origin of the method. Wonhyo himself demonstrated the ability to transform old texts into clear and effective instructions without losing depth. Finally, upaya requires humility. Even an effective method can exhaust its resource, and the practitioner must be able to let it go or replace it. Impatient striving for results leads to fixing attachments to techniques and to new formations of mind. The true virtue of upaya is to be an instrument, not a goal. The teaching serves awakening, not the practitioner's self-assertion. With such awareness, upaya remains alive, and the path honest and free. The problem that practice and teaching face at the same time is that different schools and texts offer diverse maps of the path, and these maps sometimes look incompatible. For a person trying to awaken, such diversity turns into a source of confusion. Which instructions to take into daily practice, which to waste time on, and which require special attention and discipline. Disparate metaphors, different terminology, and emphasis on different aspects of mind create an impression of rupture between traditions. And this rupture can blunt the desire to learn or breed dogmatism. The outcome is obvious. In the absence of a transparent way to compare teachings, they lose practical force and become a reason for disputes instead of a guiding thread. What criterion serves as the linking element in such a situation? For harmonizing doctrines, the main guide is their ability to bring about changes in human life toward liberation. This criterion continues the logic of upaya and complements it with the requirement to preserve the key practical points of each teaching. The main thing is to check whether different formulas converge in their orientation toward reducing attachment, increasing clarity of perception, and transforming motivation. At the same time, compatibility of methods at the technical level is important. Does the structure of investigating the mind match? Do the anchor points of attention and the ways of working with habit coincide? Wonhyo sees the criterion as an instrumental test. You can unite where different words point to practical skills that lead to the same result. One case illustrates this. The image of a mirror and the image of water in two texts point to the same technique, removing evaluation from phenomena and observing them without interference. The consequences of applying such a criterion are broad and tangible. It becomes possible to compose training trajectories that take the strengths of different traditions and smooth their terminological sharp edges, which makes the teaching more accessible. This allows a teacher to choose language and techniques suitable for a specific student without sacrificing depth. For the community, this means fewer conflicts over words and more attention to results. Practically, one should expect an intensification of experimental culture in the tradition. Translations become livelier, discussions more substantive, and traditional texts are suffocated by literalism when they do not lead to a change of mind. Wonhyo pushes toward this approach when he proposes reading sacred formulas as tools rather than elements of ritual identity. At the same time, the demand for clarity of results increases the responsibility of the teacher. Checking changes in the student and long-term evaluation of effects remain necessary conditions for applying any synthetic constructs. You will see that harmony built on practice requires more patience and observation than a beautiful theory. The boundary of application of this strategy must be clearly marked. Harmonization is intended for teachings that deal with changing mind and heart. It does not replace analysis of historical facts, legal prescriptions or empirical claims, where criteria of truth are different. Synthesis makes sense where the task is awakening, where techniques intersect in recursive work with attention and motivation, where a text requires precision in describing causality of events in the world or the order of rituals. Specific criteria and attention to context are appropriate. Wonhyo emphasizes the need to retain respect for the origin of practices and for their traditional form when the form carries functional information. A practical checklist for harmonization looks simple. Compare the goal of the practice, check the match of techniques, and observe changes in motivation and reaction over time. If changes are stable and oriented toward care for others, the combination is considered justifiable. The mechanism that makes enlightenment and delusion a single process is simple in essence and subtle in execution. The mind constantly interprets the flow of sensory and mental events through a layer of habitual evaluations, stories, and intentions. When this layer compresses or collapses, what remains is pure experience, with its clarity and spontaneous wisdom. Wonhyo described this as a change in attitude to experience, not that one entity switches to another, but that the constant superimposition of meanings that create the sense of separation ceases. Technically, this works through attention, which stops identifying itself with content and becomes a functional instrument returning to the nature of presence. A short conclusion about the structure of the process is this. What is usually called enlightenment is not a mystical substance, but a revealed skill of working with the mind. This skill manifests in clarity and kindness, but it can also be lost if habitual patterns are reactivated. I speak of a skill because this allows one to see enlightenment as something reproducible, trainable, and testable. Why is such a perspective needed? If you treat enlightenment as a skill, practice stops turning into a race for spiritual titles and becomes a concrete laboratory of self-transformation. For the practitioner, this means the possibility of assessing progress through changes in reaction to stress, through the reduction of automatic hostile patterns, and through the increase of care for others. Wonhyo insisted that spiritual work should show its fruits in behavior and relationships, not in possession of rare experiences. Such an approach makes the teacher's task easier, to teach not an abstract truth, but a technique that changes life. What happens to moral responsibility with such an approach? The question of the moral significance of actions remains central. The rejection of metaphysical separation does not cancel the consequences of actions. Intention and effect still form the field of evaluation. I have seen how the idea of the unity of experience can be used to justify an action, but Wonhyo emphasizes the need to cultivate a motivation that directs clarity toward help and compassion. Therefore, inner transformation must be accompanied by external verification, influence on others, and on one's own ability to act responsibly. Where does this model break? Where are its limits? The limitation lies in the following points. First, legal and empirical spheres require distinctions at the level of facts and causes, not only relations of mind. Second, in serious mental disorders, an oversimplified interpretation of an experience as a liberated state can hinder professional help. Third, in social and political contexts, the idea of unity of consciousness does not remove the requirement for concrete decisions and responsibility for consequences. Wonhyo took these limits into account and prescribed careful correctness in transferring spiritual intuitions into the world of everyday institutions. The conclusion is practical and cautious at the same time. Wonhyo's approach proposes working with the mind as an instrument, training attention, checking changes in behavior, and maintaining a motive of service. At the same time, keep your eyes open to the context in which you act. Where precise distinctions are needed, use them without hesitation. And where the task is liberation from attachments and critical interpretations, turn to unity as a practice. If you combine this technique with an honest assessment of consequences, you will see that the limits of the teaching are not a weakness, but a guarantee of its maturity. Wonhyo always returned practice to these two pillars: clarity of experience and responsibility in the world. How does emptiness turn into luminosity? And why does the absence of self-essence become a source of sharp, clear experience? By the word emptiness is meant the absence of an independent, self-sufficient essence and phenomena. Luminosity, illumination, is when experience becomes transparent, when what is experienced manifests without layers of habitual interpretations. The mechanism of the transition is simple to describe and subtle in execution. When the mind stops holding everything inside the constant story, I am this, the energy previously spent on adjustment and justification is freed. As a result, the habitual haze disappears. Perception seems more accurate. Thoughts lose their compulsive authoritative tone. Sensations arrive with natural fullness. Wonhyo described this as a shift in relation to experience, not as a transformation of content, but as an altered function of attention that stops pressing on phenomena and allows them to shine with their qualities. Technically, the process is related to a change in the operation of the mind's predictive schemes. We tend to maintain stable versions of the world for the sake of economy of effort. These versions filter data and fit facts to required meanings. The removal of one such scheme leaves space where each sensation and thought becomes available without previous filtration. As a result, perception becomes more differentiated and at the same time more whole, because the constant tension between object and its meaning disappears. Wonhyo moved attention away from theoretical reasoning toward how this shift manifests in the body and in actions. It's easier to recognize impulses, quicker to release long-standing reactions, clearer to see causal links in one's own behavior. The consequences for practice and life are tangible. Luminosity increases the capacity for precise action, since it reduces dramatization and automatic responding. You begin to respond where previously you would reply with a story, and to make decisions based on directly available data rather than old scripts. This clarity shows up in relation to others. Clear perception weakens fears and projections, from which care and empathy arise more naturally. Wonhyo emphasized that clarity and compassion go hand in hand, because seeing phenomena without overlays makes it easier to recognize suffering and ways to alleviate it. The effectiveness of practice is measured not by external rituals, but by the persistence of this quality of presence in difficult situations. The limits of applying the notion of emptiness as luminosity require a clear acknowledgement of contexts where insight alone is insufficient. Law, medicine, and social institutions deal with facts and consequences that require clear distinctions and evidence-based logic. Clinical cases where basic psychic functions are disturbed demand professional help and a cautious approach from practice. Shifting responsibility onto a mystical formula or assigning any experience a deep meaning without verification is risky. Wonhyo proposed developing the ability to discriminate, cultivate mindfulness, check manifestations of clarity in behavior, and evaluate its fruits by how much harm to others is reduced. Support practice with simple attention exercises, record changes in reactions, and verify them in life outcomes. Then emptiness becomes a source of clarity rather than a trick of the mind. Practice requires respect for gradualness and patience. Insights come and go, and the task is not to grab rare experiences, but to integrate them into everyday life. It is important to create conditions, sufficient rest, supportive relationships, an honest assessment of one's influence on the world. Society and tradition can provide structures, but the living experiment remains personal. Watch how responsibility changes. True clarity does not remove duties. It makes them more precise and humane. On this path, kindness toward oneself is valuable. It keeps openness and prevents fanaticism. Practice patiently, check changes through small steps, and share experience with honest witnesses. When practice is placed above words, the changes become tangible. Only the beautiful argumentation is lost, while habitual reactions, behavior, and responsibility change. The result is easy to check daily. Fewer automatic accusations, more clear actions, less inner turmoil over small irritations. For you, this means that teaching becomes an experiment, and success is measured not by a quotation, but by how a person lives through their choices, and how much surrounding pain actually diminishes. The reason for this shift is simple and deep. Words form maps of the world. Maps set expectations, and expectations govern the motor patterns of mind and body. When the map adapts to reality, it is economical and convenient, but the map can hide what is happening right now. Practice, however, acts directly on the mechanisms that sustain the map. Attention is trained, habitual reactions delaminate, and the body stops automatically confirming old narratives. As a result, a living sense of causal connections becomes clearer, and theory receives its test in everyday consequences, in settled behavior, in the resilience of empathy, in the ability to keep a calm gaze in conflict. One simple situation will show how this works in practice. When someone criticizes you harshly, the brain immediately launches a familiar script. If practice is developed, you hear the criticism as a physical sensation, distinguish the imposter reply, and can allow a pause. That pause turns the habitual storm into a conscious choice, and the consequences for relationships change. Not only the inner stance changes, but the body language changes. The tone of voice changes. Verifiable signs that the teaching is affecting real interactions. A clarification is important for proper application of this idea. Practice does not mean blind repetition of technique. It is a systematic testing of changes. By practice, I mean sequential acts of attention, moral effort, and regular checking of the fruits in behavior and in relation to others. Practice requires honesty in measurement. Note how often anxiety fires in the old way, how quickly compassion returns, how steadily the harm done to others decreases. Empty rituals, bohemian discussion of abstract ideas, and collecting quotations by themselves do not create verifiable change unless accompanied by attentive work in the field of life. Wonhyo sought such testing and emphasized that the teaching should be a means of liberation, not an intellectual exercise. Wonhyo proposed transferring contentious formulas into the body of practice, touching each assertion with the fingers of concrete habits and reactions. Wonhyo believed that if a doctrine does not alleviate suffering in concrete actions, its value is doubtful. He did not reject words as such, but he demanded that words serve action. Wonhyo saw the community and teacher as places where results can be checked, because the test happens in life with other people, not only in the head. The tie to your practice is both simple and strict. Choose one habitual reactive pattern and watch it for a week. Note the moments of activation, try short techniques, and record the results in relationships and in the quality of decisions. Correction is measured by how often you return to previous automatisms and how quickly your choice becomes more accurate and kind. If the teaching changes that tally, it works. If not, it needs work in the field of practice until the fruits become visible. Wonhyo taught to trust this test. It is through it that philosophy turns into a path and knowledge into a genuine skill for living. One line from a sutra in a certain practice ceases to be abstract wisdom and becomes a tool used to correct the breath and shift our reactive habit. In some daily ritual, the words serve not to be memorized or to ornament speech, but to provide an anchor for attention in moments of irritation or fear. I have seen how one short phrase turned instant rage into a noticeable pause. The pause itself was already evidence of change. This particular case is important because it shows the transition of text into an operative technique, available to the hand, eye, and tongue of the practitioner. From this example, the general idea is built. Texts in the Buddhist tradition are a craft of salvation, a set of techniques created to change the position of the mind. The sutra is thought of as a tool, as a rope by which one can be lifted out of the swamp of suffering. The construction of the text takes into account bodily rhythms, imagery, and mode of delivery so that it works in concrete situations. Wonhyo constantly emphasized that words gain meaning through action, not through abstract solidity. This explains why the same formula in the hands of a lazy reader remains an empty sign, while in the body of discipline it begins to change chains of reaction. The mechanism is simple. The text directs attention and sets a new habitual point of support. The word becomes an anchor to which the mind returns in a rupture. This changes the pattern of conditioned reflexes because an accent is inserted between stimulus and response that redirects the process. Wonhyo proposed translating written instructions into bodily habits: repetition, voice, posture, breath, so that the text would activate not a thought, but a process. When a text is embedded in the repeatable ritual, it ceases to exist as a proposition and becomes an accessible procedure. This generalization entails a practical consequence. Text must be tested in the field of life, observing what changes in behavior and in relation to others. For you, this means treating sutras as tools that are tested by results. Wonhyo insisted on honest testing. If words do not give lasting relief in concrete deeds, they should be reworked in practice or set aside for other cases. Such testing requires discipline and honesty because results appear in habits, not in elegant reasoning. The limits of this idea are important. A text as a tool is valuable when there is a living practice, pedagogical support, and a shared orientation toward reducing suffering. Words lose their functionality if they are possessed like a talisman or used only to enhance the status of the bearer. Wonhyo respected the written tradition but demanded that it serve action. This means that a quotation by itself does not guarantee change. Additionally, some texts are intended for specific contexts and may not be suitable outside the workshop of tradition without proper translation. The practical advice that follows from this understanding is simple. Take one text and try to integrate it into a repeating action so that it becomes a cue to stop attention or change the breath. Note how often the new habit activates, how much it changes tone of voice and gestures. Wonhyo would consider this an honest engagement with the text. The exam of a word is its ability to ease concrete actions. If no changes occur, the text requires another form of application or a different technique altogether. A text remains a powerful tool when it is held in the hands of a craftsperson of practice. But there is another side. The instrumentality of a text requires careful handling. Not every technique suits every time and body. Here, flexibility is needed. Change the rhythm, shorten formulas, translate imagery into simple commands for breath and attention. Practice wins when the text becomes living material that can be honed by experience, not dogma. Then words stop being a barrier between a person and change and become a bridge by which steps of everyday transformation become possible. This requires patience. Small shifts in practice accumulate into steady change, and it can be measured only by life. The rule is simple and bold. Awakening is available to a person in their ordinary life. Wonhyo believed that the teaching should reach the hands of those who work, feed a family, care for children, and live amid human concerns. This is not a declaration of equality of status. It is an assertion that the path is formed from actions that can be repeated in everyday circumstances, and that directly change the way one reacts to the world. A woman at the market would repeat a short line from a sutra to herself while arranging her wares. When irritation arose because of a late customer, breath and voice returned her to a calm rhythm. The short practice became an accessible technique for her. Wonhyo often cited such living cases as proof of the approach's effectiveness. The tension lies in the fact that accessibility in principle is not the same as immediate practical accessibility. Language, ritual complexity, social obligations, and entrenched habits turn a simple possibility into a difficult skill. Many people hear the slogan of accessibility and continue to feel the gap between word and action. The promise exists, the means of application are often absent. The reasons for this gap are clear. Instructions are given in book form and require translation into the body. The teaching presumes a certain daily rhythm that many do not have. A teacher may be distant and the community dispersed. The mechanism of the problem is that the text remains a text until it clutches onto a repeating habit. The consequence is that people take the idea but do not experience a lasting change in relation to loved ones, to stress, to pain. Wonhyo framed these limits as the craft's task. The teaching must be transformed so that it works under concrete conditions. How to resolve this tension in practice? There are several simple ways tried by tradition and suited to modern life. Translate one formula into a bodily gesture and repeat it 3 times in the morning and 3 times in the evening. Shorten a formula to a couple of words and tie it to the inhale. Ask someone nearby to remind you of the practice at a specific moment of the day. Create short joint practices among neighbors or colleagues so that shared discipline supports individual effort. Wonhyo emphasized that the choice of form depends on a person's life. A morning work rhythm requires a different entry into practice than evening meditation in solitude. The limits of this solution are obvious and deserve honest recognition. Accessibility does not remove the need for guidance, does not absolve responsibility for regularity, and does not guarantee quick results. Results are measured in changes of attitude and behavior, not in rhetorically adopted beliefs. For you, this means a simple experiment. Choose a small technique, insert it into your routine, observe changes in your attitude toward work and people. Adjust the form to your body and time. Wonhyo would say, test words with deeds and gently adapt the method to your life. This exercise is not a race for an ideal, but the craftsperson's way. Measure the strength of the habit, notice shifts, adjust the tool. If the technique fades after a week, do not blame yourself. Change the form, shorten it, shift the time, attach it to another action. Good practice is flexible and simple. It becomes reliable when reminders, nearby people, and repeatability are built into it. Observation is also important. Write one sentence about your state once a day. It is not a report, but a mirror showing where practice works and where it drowns in routine. Share successes and failures with those around you. A sincere account of difficulties vivifies practice and provides space for support. The simplest reminders are signs of care, not control. Over time, these small signals weave into the fabric of the ordinary, where reaction becomes intentional. Then, even a crisis turns into an opportunity to learn to act differently. Keep interest in your experience, like a master with an instrument. Test it, clean it, retune it. Thus, teaching ceases to be an abstract idea and becomes a way of living. Remember, small steps every day are more important than sudden efforts. And refine. There are two registers of intention that are immediately noticeable if you look closely. One register I would call the directed light, a clear striving to be free from the causes of suffering, an aspiration toward awakening that sets the tone for every action. The second is the warm background of habit, a barely perceptible impulse that colors choice without a clear plan or goal. Wonhyo drew attention precisely to a difference between these registers as the key to understanding what makes an action spiritually significant. Intention, in his interpretation, is not a mysterious spiritual substance, but a quality of attention and motive that gives weight to action. It determines where energy goes and how an action is experienced from within. Like a compass, intention shows direction. Like a filter, it alters the perception of consequences. Wonhyo believed that the moral appraisal of an act in the Dhammic sense runs through this internal vector, not through external form or result alone. Why does this work? The reason is that a mind directed with clarity organizes body and speech differently. Attention gathers, cognitive resources are redistributed, habitual reactions become transparent. The process's structure includes an adjustment of motive that can be felt as a subtle change in breathing and the timbre of thought. Changes in behavior and in relation to outcomes follow. The consequences are simultaneously obvious and not. Actions that grow from clear intention less often produce inner discord and more often lead to lasting changes of character and perception. This analytical picture is one to which Wonhyo repeatedly returned when speaking about the moral and spiritual effectiveness of practice. How to distinguish directed intention from background impulse. Ask yourself a simple question and observe the answer. Is the desire stable, or does it scatter at the first difficulty? Is it connected to clear care for the welfare of others, or only to the desire for personal comfort? Does it include a readiness to correct course if the action causes harm? You do not have to invent a perfect motivation. Honesty in observation is more important. Subtle self-reflection and the brief pause before acting often reveal the truth of motive. The image of the body helps make intention explicit. When attention is directed inward, the shoulders relax, breathing evens out, steps slow. By contrast, the background habit manifests as a slight rush in automatic repetition of old reactions. Wonhyo suggests catching these signals not as grounds for condemnation, but as diagnostic tools. Body and breath are indicators of inner direction. The limits of this idea must be fixed. Intention is an important marker, but it does not negate the consequences of the external world. Sometimes, sincere motivation bumps up against situational constraints, social structures, and unforeseen effects. Assessing actions in the public field remains a complex and multidimensional task. Intention gives an internal measure, not a universal justificatory map. Wonhyo clearly saw that work on motivation is a long-term process, requiring guidance and practice. Fixation is useful for practice. Formulate 3 simple questions before acting. Do heart and mind agree on this? Does the action serve to reduce suffering? Are you ready to accept the consequences? Make this short test a habit. Track changes through bodily signs and an honest report to yourself. Support intention with repetition and with contact with those who practice nearby. Wonhyo noted that a group and a teacher help keep motivation from dispersing. Intention is not a philosophical abstraction. It is a tool that, with regular work, turns isolated acts into a path. Ritual is primarily a support for attention and inclination, a way to give practice a form that can be sustained in ordinary life. Ritual gathers and transfers motivation into the body and everydayness. Through a sequence of movements, words, and pauses, attention is folded into habit, and habit becomes an available support in a difficult moment. The body stores the order of the ritual. Memory remembers the rhythm. Speech fixes meaning. And as a result, an inner impulse gains an external point of support. This external organization makes it easier to renew intention, because you do not have to invent a beginning each time. It is presented in a ready-made form that can be repeated. For the mind, repetition functions like training. Neural pathways strengthen. Vague desires acquire contours. And this makes practice reproducible even in fatigue or destruction. The mechanism of ritual action is multi-layered. On the sensory level, the ritual switches attention from a chaotic stream to specific movements and sounds. On the emotional level, it creates a subtle coloration of respect and concentration that amplifies motivation. On the social level, joint performance of a ritual forms a shared tonality that supports individual participants. Within this set of functions, the ritual works as a container for intention. It preserves and multiplies what is already in you and makes gradual deepening of attention possible. I have noticed that returning to a familiar form gives the chance to meet the unchanging content of the mind, rather than fleeing from it into a new idea or technology. Here is an important conclusion about the usefulness of ritual. It turns isolated efforts into a stable practice. Habit organized through ritual reduces the fragmentation of the day, transforming random good intentions into consecutive actions. For you, this means less struggle with procrastination and more opportunities to meet difficult moments with a support that can be used both automatically and consciously. One might ask why the formal side produces such an effect. The answer is that form is a mediator between the heart and the flesh. Words and gestures create concentration. They make a frame within which clarity arises. The frame functions not as limitation, but as elevation. It frees energy, directs it, and makes prolonged attention possible. When the ritual becomes alive, it does not distract, but enhances presence. When ritual loses its aliveness, it remains an external shell. Distinguishing these states is part of practice. Listening to whether attention is enlivened by the action, or the action remains mechanical. This check helps keep ritual in its functional role. The boundary of the idea must be clearly outlined. Ritual performs a supportive function. Its value is determined by how much it enhances inner work. Ritual does not become a measure of spirituality in itself. The indicator of real effectiveness lies in change in relation to experience, in the ability to maintain attention in difficult situations. If ritual serves only as external form without accompanying observation, it preserves form but loses transformative power. In daily practice, one must track this threshold and use ritual as a means of testing. Does the mind become clearer, purer, kinder when the form is kept? Wonhyo paid attention to the ritual side of practice precisely as a tool of transformation. For Wonhyo, what mattered was not the decorative quality of actions, but their capacity to direct the mind toward clarification and responsibility. He emphasized that ritual works in conjunction with intention and community. Then it serves as a bridge between personal motivation and stable, practical discipline. Wonhyo advised treating ritual as the craft of inner growth. Hone it carefully, observe the effect, and remain ready to change the form if it ceases to support awakening. This keeps ritual alive and effective in the work on oneself. The main problem in working with a teacher in a community is the transformation of an environment intended for awakening into a source of dependency and illusions. When relationships become a set of roles and expectations, attention ceases to function as an instrument of inquiry and becomes attachment to authority. This emergence of a habit of relying on external signals instead of inner discernment reduces the ability to see one's own motives and the mind's inaccuracies. To understand why this happens, a criterion must be singled out that can check the quality of transmission and the life of the community. The criterion is simple and practical. To what extent does the presence of the teacher and community lead to measurable change in relation to experience? This is not abstract benevolence and not the beautiful language of teachings, but the concrete ability to retain clarity and kindness in the face of difficult events. Wonhyo wrote that true transmission is determined by a person beginning to relate differently to thoughts, emotions, and bodily reactions. This criterion is tested in everyday life. Does automatic irritation decrease? Does readiness to take responsibility for actions increase? Does the habit of seeking consolation in self-justifications change? If this criterion is present, practical consequences arise that can be observed in the life of the community. Practice becomes less formal and more alive. Discussions turn into joint inquiry, and the teacher serves as a mirror that helps each person see blind spots. In such conditions, discipline does not press down. It helps to build regularity and depth. Wonhyo noted that the right field of transformation acts like a catalyst. It accelerates the process of recognizing one's own patterns and makes a direct entry possible into that level of attention where change occurs. A culture of responsibility forms in the group, where everyone feels that his or her awakening matters for the whole. If the criterion is not met, the consequences are also obvious. The popularity of a teacher without checking the fruits of practice leads to the strengthening of selfish tendencies and to the solidification of superficial religiosity. Communication within the group can become a source of confirmation for habitual narratives and a way to avoid personal work. This deprives the practitioner of tools for recognition and leaves the illusion of progress in the absence of deep change. It is important for you to be able to see these consequences before they take root. The practical signs that the environment works for the benefit of awakening are simple to observe and at the same time profound. Notice how conversation changes. More interest in how a person meets difficulties, less desire to be right. Look at the teacher. Presence means ease in interaction, the ability to honestly reflect one's own mistakes, and the readiness to direct people to direct practice rather than to rituals performed for praise. Wonhyo suggested evaluating a mentor not by words, but by how much his or her presence activates your capacity to sustain clarity. The boundary of this idea is clear. Neither a teacher nor a community can do your inner work for you, and no one guarantees instant enlightenment. They can accelerate the process, create conditions, and give corrective feedback, but experience changes directly in the field of your attention. Wonhyo emphasized that transmission is valuable when it fosters independence and the courage to look at oneself. Therefore, a sensible approach is to seek connection with those who demonstrate the fruits of practice, while simultaneously keeping personal responsibility for your own awakening. The mechanism of the paradox is simple in structure and sly in operation. It strikes not at arguments, but at habitual connections between concepts. When the mind tries to fit established schemes onto a new situation, the paradox breaks the link between word and experience and opens a brief interval of unbiased attention. In that interval, the possibility arises to see that previous explanations were only a web of thoughts, not the mind's direct activity. The paradox works as a tool that intentionally stumps the mind so that it stops acting by pattern and allows direct perception to arise. Short point. The paradox trains attention, not logic. Why is this important for a practitioner? Because most of the mind's traps rest on confidence in concepts and on the quiet automatism of reasoning. The paradox brings that confidence into the light and forces you to meet the moment when meaning dissolves and only sensation remains. Wonhyo used such methods so that a person would stop hiding behind beautiful explanations and enter simple, looking at what is happening. This is not play for play's sake. It is a path to immediate verification. Will you tolerate uncertainty, or will you run to find a new theory that restores your comfort? Further explanation. In practice, the paradox is linked with breathing and attention. When you meet a statement that does not fit your representation, the body is the first to feel tension, and the mind hurriedly tries to resolve it. If at that moment you sustain attention on the sensation without striving to solve it, the tension dissolves by itself and clarity appears. Wonhyo proposed not simply to shock the mind, but to accompany the shock with the skill of endurance, so that the paradox becomes a catalyst, not a finish. A small everyday example. You think about your mistake and find 1,000 excuses. The sudden question, who is reproducing these excuses, forces you to slow down and see the structure of the excuses as a movement rather than as truth. Where does this mechanism fail? The reasons are trivial and useful to know. The paradox easily turns into an intellectual trick if it is used without reliance on practice and ethical maturity. When the paradox remains merely a beautiful formula, it feeds self-admiration and the ability to confuse others. Another mode of breakdown is the premature use of the paradox on a person not ready to tolerate uncertainty. Instead of insight, there arises vague bewilderment and disappointment. Finally, the paradox loses force if its goal is forgotten. It serves to open clarity, not to create mystery for the sake of mystery. This means there are limiting boundaries to its application. The paradox is effective as a technique when it is embedded in mindfulness practice, when there is a teacher and feedback, and when the aim is to change the relation to experience. Wonhyo stressed the importance of accompanying the paradox with kindness and patience. Sharp words are not enough. A support of honesty and responsibility is needed. Otherwise, the paradox turns into rhetoric rather than a means of awakening. The conclusion is simple and practical. Use paradoxes as a tool to jolt the mind, but check the effect by how much you are able to remain clear and kind in difficult situations. Watch that the paradox does not operate as an evasion of action and responsibility. If the question breaks an old pattern and leaves you attentive, the technique worked. When only wit remains without a change in habits, it is time to return to the hard work. patient looking into experience. Wonhyo taught this: technique should lead to life, not be an end in itself. What exactly does it mean to speak of the Dharma as work with the mind, and why does that word change the approach to practice? The psychologizing of the Dharma is the translation of the teaching's language into terms of interior work. Attention as an instrument, motivation as a measure of actions, experience as a field of inquiry. Wonhyo invested this translation with a simple idea. The teaching should show how the mind's habits operate and how they can be investigated right in the moment. This is not academic reflection, but a technique of observing how thoughts arise, how feelings take form, and how the motor of intention directs behavior. When you look at the Dharma as a set of procedures for the mind, the way questions are posed changes too. The center becomes the mechanics of experience. Which reactions trigger anxiety, how attachment forms, which thoughts keep one in a repetitive loop. Wonhyo pointed out that clarity comes through simple observation and precise description of what is happening, through the ability to name the process and not only evaluate the result. Such an approach makes the demands of practice concrete. Notice a thought, watch the breath, investigate motivation before acting. The reason for this shift is clear. When practice is aimed at transforming the mind, it becomes verifiable in everyday life. The structure of this work consists of several interrelated steps. The first step is attention, the ability to hold an object without fleeing into thought. The second is investigation, a careful and curious analysis of the composition of experience. The third is correction of intention, a conscious redirection of energy. The consequences of this structure are visible in behavior and relationships. Automatic reactions decrease, the capacity to respond consciously increases, and motivation more often becomes oriented toward the good of others. Wonhyo believed that it is precisely through the sequence of these steps that a stable shift in perception and in ethics becomes possible. Practical consequences are important and simple. The shift from a doctrinal attitude toward the Dharma to everyday practice means that results are judged by changes in reaction to stress and by the expansion of attention, not by verbal formulations of belief. Wonhyo stressed that the teaching wins when its methods are integrated into working life and household duties, when practice generates resilience, clarity, and kindness in real interactions. This requires mentorship and honest feedback because inner changes are hard to see alone. There are clear boundaries to this psychological reading. The line runs where technique turns into an instrument of increased effectiveness without recourse to the motive of liberation or to responsibility toward others. The psychological perspective retains its authenticity if it serves awakening and moral growth. Wonhyo warned of the importance of combining mindfulness with an ethical compass. Inner work must lead to greater responsiveness, not to a better ability to manipulate one's states for personal gain. If you practice such a reading of the Dharma, check the effect by 3 parameters. Does your habitual reaction to difficult emotions change? Does clarity in choosing actions appear? Does the inclination to help others grow? If the answer is positive, the psychological interpretation is justified and fruitful. If changes prove superficial, then a return to the discipline of attention, to an honest dialogue with a teacher, and to a renewed examination of motivations is required. Wonhyo taught that the Dharma is a tool for working with the mind, and at the same time, a path of responsible living. The boundaries of this work are defined by its usefulness for liberation and for well-intentioned relations. From this follows a concrete effect. The canon functions as a collection of means, and the result of that functioning is the ability to pick a technique that begins to work in your mind from the first repetition. A multitude of texts creates practical flexibility. A technique recorded in one sutra can awaken insight in one person and remain meaningless for another, because minds differ in habits, in tendencies toward images, and in vulnerable spots. The result is this. The system of teachings turns into a set of tools measured by their capacity to change the reactions of a living practitioner, not by the coherence of doctrine. This simple consequence gives the canon's working criterion an immediately practical face. Why are so many forms and styles collected? The question is natural and contains its own answer. The teaching is aimed not at creating a single academic picture, but at conducting awakening through different gates. Some instructions are designed for those inclined to logic and word, others for those who enter more easily through contemplative images, and others through bodily practice. Such distribution of methods has its reason in the understanding of the mind's nature as a manifold activity. The mind manifests through different streams: sensation, imagination, thought, will. An effective dharma responds to that multiplicity with various techniques. The historical verbosity of the canon translates into a philosophical meaning. Texts serve the means, and the means adapt to conditions of life, temperament, and the practitioner's readiness. This clarification is important because the very idea of many means requires limits. Many does not equal arbitrariness. The value of a method is measured by its ability to bring clarity, change habitual reaction, and strengthen the moral roots of action. When choosing a support, one considers three criteria: consistency of effect in practice, attention to motive, and compatibility with the stability of life. These criteria help navigate the richness of texts. They allow choosing not by the aesthetic of a phrase, but by whether the technique actually reduces entrenched anxiety, increases clarity of perception, and frees one from repetitive patterns. The collection of means remains coherent as long as each part serves the transformation of mind and supports the overall orientation towards responsibility for others. The appeal to Wonhyo here is natural, because his thinking seems stretched between letter and usefulness. He saw the canon as a fabric of means, not as a code of final definitions. Wonhyo emphasized that sutras and commentaries have their function: to provoke a change in life, and assess them by whether they change the way of presence and relation in the world. For you, this means a simple rule of practice: approach texts as tools, test them in practice, discuss them with the teacher, monitor motivation and result. Wonhyo insisted on honest verification. If a method leads to greater responsiveness and resilience, record it as a working tool. If not, continue searching within that fabric for another instrument until practice begins to bear fruit. Practice, however, requires one more important condition: a social clearing where results are discussed and verified. The context of community, a teacher, and a partner help distinguish a short-term effect from a deep change. This is not a call to blind following, but to honest accountability. What exactly changed in your intention, in your relation to pain, in your capacity to hear others? It is also important to remember gradualness. The canon's tools are powerful, but not all of them are safe if applied without readiness and without moral support. Therefore, ethics here is not a separate topic, but the foundation that makes practice fruitful and sustainable. Returning to life after sitting meditation is also part of practice. The true criterion of a technique is its translatability to everyday circumstances and its ability to change relations in deeds and words. Finally, the question of creativity remains open. How to adapt old prescriptions to the new ills of the age? The answer is simple: with respect for the root of the teaching and with attention to the fruit these prescriptions bear today. Practice sincerely, with love. One case. You come to an instruction where you ask to sit for several days in a row and note the breath every morning. On the first day, it feels like a foreign exercise. On the third, a silence appears inside. And on the seventh, your relation to anxiety changes. It no longer governs your actions. This simple story shows how change is born from initial trust. This particular case illustrates the general principle. Faith and reasoning work together as two supports of practice. Faith is not blind acceptance, but the resolution to give a method a chance, a long-term investment of attention in a single line. Reasoning is the mind that tracks results, formulates hypotheses, and tests them again in experience. Wonhyo drew attention to the fact that trust directs effort and makes continuity possible, and that reason supports honesty and clarity. If the effect does not arise, thought helps correct the approach. The acquired balance gives the practice resilience, which manifests in three simple indicators: duration of effect, change in motivation, and carryover of changes into life. When these indicators are present, you can consider that the combination of trust and thinking works. Unfold the situation a little deeper. Faith is responsible for the beginning and for patience. It includes the willingness to repeat the technique, to return to the support again and again, even if initial results are modest. Reasoning takes on the function of verification. It measures how much practice reduces automatic reactions, how much the ability to hear others changes, how much the field of attention expands. For Wonhyo, faith did not turn into dogma. He saw it as a working investment of attention. Reason was for him not an opponent of devotion, but its companion, an instrument that prevents practice from becoming mystified and anchors it to real change. The meaning of this link is that both qualities develop together. Trust without verification risks remaining an emotional attachment. Thought without trust remains theory that does not reach the body and habits. According to Wonhyo, practice requires both. You give the method time and simultaneously remain an observer of its fruits. Such an approach reduces the illusion of quick fixes and maintains honesty before one's own experience. It is precisely this combination that turns random experiences into stable character change. Boundaries must be indicated immediately. Faith does not grant immunity against mistakes, and reason does not replace moral checking. When a method causes increased aggression, suppression of feeling, or the severing of ties without a clear improvement in sensitivity, that is a sign that one should stop and recheck. Wonhyo warned of the need for a careful ethical support. Practical benefit is measured not only by inner ease, but also by how your responsibility toward others changes. Therefore, the criteria remain practical: change of behavior in everyday life, stability of intention, improvement in the ability to act with care. There is also a technical limitation. Reasoning requires data, and data are given by practice. Long conversations about meaning and nuance without regular checking lead to intellectualization of experience. Wonhyo valued the clarity that arises against the background of direct attention. Therefore, the mind should keep records, a journal of observations, of feedback from a teacher, so that thoughts do not wander on their own. Thus, reasoning becomes a tool of refinement, rather than a plaything of the mind. The practical outcome for you is simple. Give methods a chance through consistency, and at the same time, keep track of results. What changed in intention, in reaction to pain, in the ability to listen? If you maintain attention on these indicators, faith and thought will become the compass that leads not to dogma, but to real transformation. Wonhyo proposed precisely such honest verification: trust supported by reason, and reason nourished by living experience. This is a working pair in which each element has its boundaries and its cost. The rule that Wonhyo guided himself by in synthesizing teachings is simple. Take elements of teachings as working tools and test them in practice. The goal is not to collect an encyclopedia of teachings, but to create a set of techniques, each of which leads to clarity of mind and greater capacity to act with care. Wonhyo suggested looking at doctrines through the prism of their usefulness for awakening, translating philosophical formulas into concrete supports of attention, motivation, and behavior. How this looks at the technical level. First, you identify the aim of practice. What changed capacity you want to develop? Then you translate the positions of different schools into operations. What specifically to do with the body, with attention, with speech, with intention? One simple example. Take the breath as an object from meditation and add, from attention, disciplines the rule of a brief check of intention before acting. A very short daily ritual that changes habitual automaticity. One who advised such combinations when they make life easier and strengthen practice. Tension arises around criteria of compatibility. Different schools use different vocabularies and different assumptions about what is primary in the mind and how to measure change. If you mix techniques without checking, confusion in practice arises. The technique works, but the goal loses clarity. Or the goal remains while the method ceases to be operational. This tension cannot be dismissed as abstraction. It manifests directly in your experience, in how clarity grows or diminishes, how reactions change in daily life. The reasons for such conflict are simple. Each school is built around its own premises, its own charging of motivation, and its own feedback methodology. If you do not align a school's language with your practical aim, the operation loses footing and stops being reproducible. Wonhyo pointed to the need for clear translations between terms and actions. The structure of a method then looks like a map. On one axis, the aim, on the other, the set of operations, between them, the criteria of verification. The consequences of defining these maps are obvious. They determine what is counted as success and what data to gather. The main criterion of compatibility is the preservation of the target function. Before combining elements, ask in what the desired change consists, how to measure it, and what side effects are acceptable. Translating terms into operational instructions requires patience. If a concept, like liberation, turns into a list of actions with excessive metaphor, practical testing loses meaning. Wonhyo demanded that every borrowed formula have a clear test in everyday life. Practical difficulties are felt at the level of habits and authorities. People tend to keep the form and language of a teaching as markers of belonging, and this interferes with flexible work with methods. Here, it is important to act carefully and with respect. Preserve respect for the context while adapting the technique. If you approach it hastily, an empty formality appears that does not change heart or behavior. Wonhyo taught working honestly with this tension, recording the result and discussing it with a mentor or practice community. The resolution is simple and concrete. Do small experiments, record the data, and tie the results to behavior in life. Start with one goal. Introduce one new method. Check after a week for changes in reaction and intention. If there is an effect, strengthen the combination. If there is no effect, analyze where the map translates concepts poorly into operations. This cycle of translation, test, and adjustment is the core of Wonhyo's method of synthesis. It turns abstract combinations into working recipes. For you, the outcome is clear. Approach synthesis like an engineering problem of the spirit. Formulate the goal, translate verbal positions into concrete actions, measure the result, and preserve the context of the tradition that gave the method. Wonhyo showed that the wisdom of many systems becomes useful when it serves to improve the ability to live with clarity and care. Maintain this cycle in your practice, and each borrowed element will show whether it truly serves awakening. There is the image of a monastery, where practice flows in an organized schedule, under the attention of a mentor. And there is the image of the street, where people practice in breaks between tasks, in a line, and in conversation with a neighbor. Wonhyo saw both fields of life and placed their significance side by side. The path of solitary discipline and the path of everyday care for clarity. Both lead to awakening, and both deserve tools that work where the person lives. Spiritual democratization in his understanding means exactly this, expanding the available methods so that engaging in them does not depend on titles, education, or special conditions. This is not a call to simplify to superficial forms, but a demand to translate practice into the register of everyday operations. Short checks of intention, simple supports for attention, clear principles of motivation that can be applied between tasks and in ordinary duties. Wonhyo proposed treating the teaching as a set of working tools for a broad audience, not as a preserve for the chosen. The reasons for this approach are clear. The structure of his practice is convenient and reproducible. The consequences are influential. The reason is that practice loses power if it is tied exclusively to institutional form and high barriers to access. The structure consists in techniques being translated into concrete actions that can be managed in ordinary life. The consequences manifest in changes to everyday reactions, in the increased ability to care, and in reduced internal fragmentation between the spiritual and the ordinary. This analytic movement, reason, translation into operation, observed effect, underlies Wonhyo's democratic approach. How to implement this consistently? Attention is required to three things: preserving depth, clarity of instruction, and responsibility for transmission. Preserving depth is expressed by ensuring the technique is accompanied by an understanding of its goal and checks. Clarity of instruction means that a term from monastic practice gets a concrete equivalent in everyday actions. Responsibility is expressed in the support of mentors and community who help maintain direction and prevent scattering of effort. Wonhyo insisted that accessibility and responsibility go together. The limits of this idea are important. Accessibility does not mean completely diluting methods or abandoning gradual training. Shortened techniques require context and periodic verification with more structured practice. Spiritual democratization presupposes preserving some rules and supports the sustained development. Otherwise, effectiveness decreases. Wonhyo noted that methods for laypeople should be autonomous in application, but connected to the source of wisdom that guarantees their depth. What this gives you specifically? You receive permission to practice right where you live. Practices become tools 2 steps away from a daily task, not a greeting from another life. Wonhyo suggested testing each technique in your own experience. If it makes the mind clearer and the heart more attentive in affairs, it deserves a place in your ritual. This criterion keeps practice honest and alive. Finally, fixing the boundaries. Spiritual democratization, according to Wonhyo, is an expansion of access conditioned on preserving context and responsibility. It is translating the craft of awakening into the language of actions without loss of depth. It is an invitation for lay people to take on practical work on attention and intention without turning the path into a fashionable commodity, while preserving relationships of transmission and community support. Keep these boundaries, and your practice will remain effective. The written text works as both testimony of lived experience and as a practice tool. It records moments of awakening, makes changes in the mind tangible, and gives the possibility to check the effectiveness of methods. Letters, notes, and sutras perform several applied functions at once. They become an external memory that returns one to a concrete experience instead of an abstract idea. They serve as a means of self-monitoring because recording allows one to see progress and patterns of reaction. They provide study material that can be discussed in community and with a mentor. A short morning note of intention and a simple check in the evening can show you the difference between intention and habitual reaction. Wonhyo related texts to craft. They are justified if they help purify the mind and if they support live verification. Text functions as mirror and as tool. As a mirror, it reflects what occurred in the mind at a particular moment. As a tool, it structures practice, offering formats for repetition and clarification. I have seen how an attention journal turns scattered efforts into systematic work. You read entries after a month and notice which methods consistently work and which require change. At the same time, the written testimony does not function by itself. Its power is revealed in comparison with experience, in dialogue with a mentor, and in repeated verification in life. The limits of this idea are clear and practical. Text does not replace direct verification in action. It does not guarantee awakening by itself and does not always convey the subtle nuances of life presence. Texts are subject to interpretation. They can be idealized or fixed into dogma if connection with practice and community is lost. Wonhyo emphasized the instrumentality of the written. The value of content is measured by how much it leads to mental transparency and lasting behavioral change, not only by the beauty of formulation. The practical consequence is simple. Keep records as working tools. Formulate the intention briefly. Record the result and the reaction time. Return to the notes accompanied by a mentor or practice partner. Keep texts compact and test their viability in real situations. Wonhyo advised treating texts as testimonies that need verification and serve as support for transmitting experience. Evaluate the written word by its fruits in life, maintain connection with living transmission, and remember the limits of text so that it remains a means of awakening rather than a replacement for the path. Practice is written for verification, not for praise. A record is valuable when it is a substrate for action. Write your intention in the morning, a short report in the evening. If you see only self-justification, change the format. Observing the body often gives the key to change. Discussion with a companion reduces blind spots and strengthens discipline. Do not write for the sake of a report. Write for clarity, even if the lines are short. When text is connected to action, it becomes both shield and tool. Let letters serve as verification, not as a claim to perfection. Text is a trace by which you can return and check the path. Discussion with a companion reduces blind spots and strengthens discipline. Discussion with a companion reduces blind spots and strengthens discipline. Discussion with a companion reduces blind spots and strengthens discipline. Discussion with a companion reduces blind spots and strengthens discipline. Discussion with a companion reduces blind spots and strengthens discipline. Discussion with a companion reduces blind spots and strengthens discipline. Discussion with a companion reduces blind spots and strengthens discipline. Discussion with a companion reduces blind spots and strengthens discipline. Discussion with a companion reduces blind spots and strengthens discipline. Discussion with a companion reduces blind spots and strengthens discipline. Discussion with a companion reduces blind spots and strengthens discipline. Discussion with a companion reduces blind spots and strengthens discipline. Discussion with a companion reduces blind spots and strengthens discipline. Let the letter be only a check. The problem is that the process of transforming the mind is easily reduced to the label awakening as a discrete event or to a set of techniques, depriving it of historical and situational fluidity. People wait for a final leap or collect a list of correct methods, believing that change is measured by the number of practices performed. This perception makes the path static, turning it into a goal that can be postponed or completed on a schedule, whereas the flow of change itself requires constant checking and adaptation. Such fixation obstructs recognizing gradual shifts, which are more important than a single loud change. The criterion for evaluating the process of mind transformation within Wonhyo's philosophy rests on changes in response and on stable clarity in everyday situations. Measure success not by the number of rituals or by the aesthetics of practice, but by how often and how deeply your reaction to all triggers changes. If habitual mechanisms of automaticity cease to automatically prevail, if presence becomes available in difficult circumstances, that is the sign of genuine movement. It is important to take into account the context and duration of these changes, not only their rare episodes. The consequence of applying such a criterion is noticeable in practice and in the community. Practice ceases to be a demonstration of knowledge and becomes a series of verifiable situations: conversation, conflict, fatigue, joy. Each of these points becomes a laboratory of the mind. This frees one from constant self-criticism and from the illusion of quick results, because evaluation is based on concrete manifestations and their repeatability. A morning intention noted in the evening will show how often it held throughout the day. When you see progress in real actions, relationships in the group change. Criteria for support become clearer. The teacher and companions offer feedback, and texts and practices take on the role of pointers leading to verification. One can imagine the process as a river where each practice is a stone, changing the flow in one local stretch. A stone sometimes directs the current, sometimes traps sediment, sometimes creates an eddy that clears the bottom. This metaphor helps keep in view that transformation consists of many local changes, and no single stone is the final solution. Wonhyo emphasized such fluidity. The teaching offers different methods depending on circumstances, and each means shows its value only in application. Analyzing the reasons, structure, and consequences of the process shows its systemic character. The reason, constant attention to conditioned reactions. The structure: routine checks, records, support of community and mentor. The consequences: gradual expansion of the ability to act from clarity. Such analysis helps shape practice as a cycle of testing and correction, not as a one-time transaction. I have seen how changing the criterion of evaluation saves one from self-deception. When you orient toward behavior in the field rather than internal reports, your approach to ritual changes, your relation to texts changes, and the role of a mentor's words changes. The limits of this idea are clear. Transformation cannot be put on a precise schedule, and its pace depends on many factors: past habits, bodily condition, social environment, quality of mentorship. Texts, instructions, and rituals function as means of verification, not as guarantees of results. Wonhyo noted that it is important to maintain a critical connection with life. Otherwise, practice turns into a formula. Mark changes by simple markers. Keep responsibility for verifying practice yourself and in community. And remember that the process of transformation is limited by concrete conditions and requires constant verification in action. Wonhyo's philosophy assembles into a practical map for practice, where ideas serve as tools rather than objects for debate. It offers guides that help translate understanding into everyday action. Unity as the initial intuition. Upaya as a test of usefulness. Emptiness as elimination. Verification through practice. The importance of community and mentorship. And paradox as a device for shifting attention. These guides work together and reveal their power when they are managed by intention and consistent verification in life. The mechanics of this approach are simple. The teaching formulates proposals on how to act. Practice tests their effect. Feedback from the real situation clarifies meaning and form. When habitual reaction begins to give way to attention, when automaticity yields to clarity, the transformation process becomes evident. Change is recorded not in words about enlightenment, but in the frequency and quality of responses to habitual irritants, in the ability to maintain presence in fatigue, in conflict, in outdated emotional patterns. The limits of this method are clear and important. Transformation requires time, bodily stability, and conditions where support exists. Texts and rituals act as pointers and trainers. Their value is revealed in the ability to provoke verifiable change, not in the authority of words. Teacher and community accelerate the process through feedback and field verification, while personal responsibility remains key. Results depend on constant application and checking, not on a single technique or ritual. Distortions arise when means become ends, when texts are read as exhaustive reports on reality, or when methodology is packaged into dogma. A focus on clever verbal skill pushes out work with the body and reactions. Paradoxes lose direction if they are manipulated as an intellectual focus, instead of being used as a means to break automatic thinking. It is important to keep understanding that the teaching is a network of methods, not a set of eternal assertions. Assembling the whole picture yields a practical plan. Develop the habit of checking reactions in everyday situations. Note changes by concrete markers. Use texts and rituals as auxiliary tools. Keep connection with a mentor and community. Apply paradoxical instructions to shift thinking, and evaluate the result by how often clarity appears. I say this so you can see how ideas come together into a method that can be tested step by step. The process of transformation cannot be packaged into a single method and cannot be measured by a single victory. It is like a craft. Small corrections, repeated checks, changes in bodily reactions, and in social interactions gradually restructure the field of the mind's activity. Watch how your tendency to act according to old patterns changes. And remember that the criterion of truth for the teaching is its practical effectiveness. A short summary without fragmenting thoughts. Unity as foundation. Upaya as the test of effectiveness. Practice as the laboratory. Emptiness as clarity. Community and mentorship as a field for verification. Paradox as an instrument of shaking. Keep these supports in sight and use them as a verifiable map, not as a picture of a final point.